There's so much focus on the accumulation phase in the financial advice world. And as a result, many of the folks we talk to fail to really think through the distribution phase, or in other words, the decumulation phase. And many of the folks that we serve are surprised to find out that they actually have a surplus in retirement, which is certainly not a bad thing. Believe me, it's better than the alternative. But at some point, they realize it's going to be hard to spend all of their nest egg during their lifetime. So in today's Whiteboard Retirement Plan Breakdown, we're going to look at Bruce and Jennifer Lee. They're 62 and 61, looking to retire in January of 2026. And I'm going to walk through their financial goals, their balance sheet, their income sources, some tax strategies available, and ultimately help them make the decision of should they give now or give at death. Welcome to another episode of the Planning for Retirement podcast. My name is Kevin Lau. I am your host, and I'm also the owner and financial planner at Imagine Financial Security. We help individuals over 50 with at least $1 million saved, maximize their retirement spending, minimize their lifetime tax bill, and worry less about the financial markets. If that describes you, make sure to follow our podcast and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We put out weekly retirement-related content specifically designed for you, who I like to call PFR Nation. All right, so we are packing. My family and I are packing, or I should say my wife and I are packing. My boys aren't really helping too much right now, but we are getting ready for another move. This is the second move in about 12 months, so not ideal, not my favorite activity to do, but we knew it was coming, and it was not a fun feeling moving from Florida. So for those of you that are maybe new or have subscribed or followed in the last 12 months, my wife and I, my family and I, we moved from the Jacksonville, St. Augustine, Florida area to Chattanooga, Tennessee last July. My wife is not originally from Chattanooga, but her family's in Chattanooga and a lot of family in Tennessee. So decided to make the move. And it's not a fun feeling moving into a home that you know you're going to move out of in the short term. Okay. And that was a little stressful for me, especially because I really loved our Florida home and I had a beautiful backyard, lots of space, just a great neighborhood, awesome neighbors. And of course, we had the pools and all that good stuff in Florida, the beaches in Florida. But we knew it was the best decision for our family to move to Chattanooga. We did that. But ultimately, we decided to rent for a year, even though my wife is from Chattanooga, has lived in Chattanooga for many, many years, or had lived in Chattanooga for many, many years. She has not lived in Chattanooga for over 20 years. So I told her, I said, listen, even though it's going to be painful, I do not want to buy a house sight unseen without knowing the area and being familiar. So let's sell our house in Florida. We'll park it, and then we'll kind of start to begin the exploratory process of Chattanooga. And to be frank with you, that was the best decision because now we found a great house we're super excited to move into. But again, the packing, not ideal. I kind of wanted to share this story because many of you who are transitioning to retirement, or maybe you've recently retired and you're potentially thinking of relocating, one of the biggest questions that we oftentimes hear is, hey, should I buy right away or should I rent for a little while? And I would my personal preference on this, even though it is very, very painful, I would highly recommend renting for a period of time, especially if you're moving to an area that you're not very familiar with. Maybe you've vacationed there for a little while. Maybe it's somewhere in Florida. Maybe it's somewhere in Tennessee or in the Carolinas. Maybe you have not lived there for a period of time. And so you may not be super familiar with the area, even though you think you know because you've been going there for a couple of weeks a year or whatever it might be. I would highly encourage you to rent for at least a year so you can get a feeler for the neighborhoods, for the area, talk to people, figure out what your routine looks like, where the stores are that you like to shop at, et cetera. My wife being Target, that was a big selling point of our rental and ultimately our new home that we're buying is just having a Target close by, having amenities close by. That may not be important to you, but maybe it is. But anyways, one of the things that we did when we moved into our house, the rental house that we're currently in Chattanooga, is we did not unbox everything. Okay. That was a little annoying for sure because we had boxes in our garage and in the basement that is not finished in our house. But it was a great decision because now we're not having to box everything up. Those are ready to go, items that you really don't use very often. And honestly, it's a good opportunity to purge a lot of stuff, which is great too. But renting for a year has really allowed us to kind of get a feel for the area, for the location, the traffic patterns. All of those are very, very important when it comes to your long-term home. So if you can swing it, if you can stomach moving twice in a 12-month period, or maybe it's twice in 18 months or 15 months, or even it's 2 years, or maybe even rent for 5 years, who knows? It's, in my opinion, is a great way to go because once you lock into that long-term house and you buy a home, you don't want to turn around and sell it in a year or two because you don't like it or you don't like the neighborhood. That's very costly. Okay. closing costs on a mortgage or closing costs on switching title. It's a painful process. I would highly encourage you to consider renting. But again, moving on May 30th. So right now I'm recording this on Thursday, May 15th. So we've got about 15 days to pack. Right now we have movers, but we did not hire them to pack our stuff just because, I don't know, we've had bad experiences with people packing our stuff. So anyways, we're doing the packing. So it's a little chaotic in my household right now, but it has been a great 12 months moving to Tennessee. And we're super thankful for our home, the home that we're moving into in a couple of weeks. And our boys are super excited. We've been visiting the house already and doing some things in the house. The former owners moved out in April. So we've had a little bit of time to kind of do some things, do some painting, some flooring, some things in the kitchen, the garage. So I'm very excited. And the garage, I don't know if this is going to work out because we've got 3 boys, but my goal is to make that my little man cave. I've got a tool set or a tool cabinets that's built into the wall. I purchased. I got some ceiling racks that I'm going to put a bunch of their storage stuff, and so we keep everything off the floor. And my goal, I don't know if this is going to work out or not. We'll see in a couple of years, once we move in and kind of see what kind of space we need in the garage. But my goal, I kept a little space open about 10 feet wide. And, the ceiling height's about 10 feet as well, maybe 11 feet. And that's where my goal is to put a little golf simulator in there. So I don't know if that's going to work out or not. Like I said, our boys, they've got a lot of stuff, a lot of toys, their tractors, their bicycles, their scooters. We've got a lot of stuff, but I put a lot of work into the storage in this garage. That is my hope. I told my wife, you can do whatever you want to do to the rest of the home, but give me my home office, which that's check that box off. And then let me get a little man cave, which in this house is going to be the garage because there is no basement. So anyways, very exciting times. But listen, a couple of weeks ago, or no, last week it was, I recorded the episode again on Thursday and it released on Tuesday. And it was this idea of sell in May and go away. And I talked about the UK, United Kingdom deal, the trade deals, which, ultimately these right now are still negotiations. Ultimately, it's sort of pausing the tariffs or reducing the tariffs back to the 10% baseline minimum and then beginning the negotiating process. And lo and behold, literally that weekend, China, same thing. We had some really good news with the China trade talks with President Trump and President Xi. And the markets really, really rallied. So far, this idea of sell in May and go away has not been the advice you want to follow. And that was ultimately the point of that podcast episode. So if you missed that one, go back and check that one out. But really, I just want to emphasize the point of these tariffs. You cannot make short-term investment decisions based on what you think is going to happen with the tariffs, because there's still so much uncertainty. Yes, there's a lot of good news and progress with regards to the UK, with China, even deals right now in the Middle East. There's so many moving pieces, and this news is continuing to evolve. My opinion from the get-go was the tariffs were a negotiating tactic to get in the door to renegotiate overall trade deals between many, many foreign countries, okay? Because everyone wants to do business with the U.S. We've got the consumers here that we have the wealthiest consumers in the world. And so every country wants to do business with the U.S. And frankly, some countries need to do business with the U.S. And so we want to keep that going. We want to keep our economy strong. So I just believe from the get-go it was a negotiating tactic, but ultimately there's still a lot of uncertainty there. So yes, the markets have rallied. The NASDAQ technically is now in a bull market. Okay. Bull market meaning a 20% rally from a previous low point. We are technically in a bull market, even though it has not recovered all of the ground that it's lost in 2025. The NASDAQ is technically in a bull market. But ultimately, it's just a reminder that you should not be moving your portfolio around based on what you think is going to happen with these trade deals with tariffs, because you don't know. I don't know. Okay. Truthfully, you should be following Trump on Truth Social because he's posting what he thinks is going to happen or what he knows is going to happen behind the scenes, which is a very interesting dynamic because it's almost like, is this insider trading? Obviously he's not trading on that, or at least he's hope he's not trading on that, but he's telling the public what is going to happen. And then ultimately, a few weeks ago, if you saw his Truth Social post, he said, this is a good time to buy. And lo and behold, that was a great time to buy. That is when this bull run really began from the get-go. But one of the bigger stories, in my opinion, in the short term, because again, I think the tariffs are going to take a little while to get resolved and the trade deals are going to take a little time to get resolved. But I think a bigger story is, of course, what is going to happen with the tax cuts, the one big, beautiful bill. Okay. Right now, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is set to sunset at the end of 2025. I don't think that's going to happen, just given what's happened politically over the last 6 months. But ultimately, there's been some challenges, particularly with Republicans, in how much SALT deduction is going to be increased by. Okay. Right now, the SALT deduction is capped at $10,000 per year. SALT stands for state and local taxes. So for high property and high income tax states, they want obviously a higher SALT deduction. Okay. They want, frankly, six figures of SALT deduction, but I don't think that's going to happen. It's going to be very expensive. But, that's really the big story to look at is what happens with the passage of the big, beautiful bill. Is it going to be passed? I think if it gets passed, if and when, in some form, when it gets passed in some form, I believe there's going to be room for the market to rally. How much it rallies depends on what's actually in the bill and how the market responds to that one. But that's really, in my opinion, one of the bigger stories. Obviously, interest rates, that's a big story with the Fed holding steady. I think they're going to hold steady for quite a while. I don't think they're going to be in a rush to cut interest rates anytime soon. I think truthfully, because Trump has been telling him to cut rates. That's sort of like, I think Powell is going to kind of stand firm and say, you can't tell me what to do. Okay, we're independent of the president. We're independent of the White House. I'm going to do what I believe is best for our Fed policy. So I think that's going to be an interesting story to watch as well. Interest rates holding steady. Inflation has come down. Inflation, actually, the reading was a little bit better than expected. I think it was 2.3% was the reading for April. So very positive on the inflation news. But again, tariffs have not really truly shown up in inflation yet. That's going to be a lag. That data is going to lag. But anyways, more important news is today, like I mentioned, I'm recording this on Thursday. This is May 15th. So it's the kickoff of the PGA Championship. It's teeing off, I should say, as we speak, as I'm recording this one. This is major number 2. Personally, as a golf nerd myself, I would love to see Spieth win the Wanamaker Trophy, becoming the 7th player to achieve the career Grand Slam in history. Rory being number 6, which just happened a month ago at Augusta National. But I just don't see it happening. Spieth he's not in good form. It's just frustrating. He's not in good form, has not won a major, I think, since 2017. And he's just not really a long hitter, which is going to be, in my opinion, requirement for Quail Hollow. Quail Hollow is a long course. It's playing a little wet because of the rain. So obviously it's easy for me to say Bryson DeChambeau is going to lift the Wanamaker Trophy, arguably one of the most popular players in golf right now, maybe the most popular player in golf, maybe outside of Rory McIlroy. And it makes a ton of sense. He's the bomber. His short game is amazing. He's obviously striking the ball very well. But I'm going Justin Rose. And I do have DeChambeau in my pool, by the way. But I have Justin Rose taking down his second major championship at Quail Hollow. He loves the course. He's coming off a second place finish at the Masters. And he has 3 top 5 finishes in his career at Quail Hollow. So courses for horses. That's what I'm looking for, the Wanamaker Trophy for the PGA Championship on Sunday. So we will see when this comes out on Tuesday. We'll see what happens. Obviously, this is going to be released a couple of days later. But I will not edit this episode. I promise you that. All right, so let's transition to this episode here. So this is volume 6 of the Whiteboard Retirement Plan. This is episode 78 of the podcast. Super exciting stuff. But anyways, I've been helping people plan for retirement for a while. Or really over the last 10 years, I've focused exclusively on the distribution phase of retirement planning, which is, maximize retirement income, withdrawal rates, minimizing lifetime taxes, optimizing legacy for heirs or charity, investment strategies in retirement, et cetera. And I have found that after working and accumulating for 30 plus years for many, many individuals, it's very difficult to transition to the spending phase. Okay. And the result, many of you, PFR Nation folks, you've oversaved for retirement because you are overachievers. And that's okay. For some of you, you want that buffer. It gives you that peace of mind. Maybe you want to keep all of your principal intact, or maybe you want to leave a large legacy to your heirs or to charity. But for many of you, you want to really enjoy the fruits of your labor or actually see that financial legacy during your lifetime as opposed to when you're gone. So we call that giving with a warm hand instead of a cold one. So in this Whiteboard Retirement Plan, we're going to break down Bruce and Jennifer Lee. Yes, Bruce Lee, one of my dad's favorite movie stars from back in the day. Love Bruce Lee. But I'm going to walk through their financial goals. We're going to look through their balance sheet. We're going to look through their income sources, their tax strategies available, ultimately help them make the decision of should they maximize assets at their death or should they do some lifetime giving? So why don't we dive into this one? First slide here, we've got their goals highlighted. And this is extracted directly from our financial planning tool. And, right now we see Bruce and Jennifer. Okay, so Bruce and Jennifer, they're currently 62 and 61, but when they plan to retire in January 2026, Bruce will be 63 and Jennifer will be 61. Okay, now longevity, who knows? There's some longevity in the family, but some not so much. Okay, so it's kind of a mixed bag when it comes to longevity. So we're kind of assuming this baseline of age 90. So we're talking about roughly a 29-year time horizon in retirement. Okay, they have a baseline expense need of about $7,000 a month, but this does not include things like healthcare. So that's an additional, we'll call it $1,000 a month. And they also have an additional 1,800 or so for their housing. Okay, they do have a mortgage, and that mortgage is going to be paid off at some point in their mid 70s. We're going to go through that a little bit later. So all in, their minimum cash flow need is about 10K a month. Okay, that's their cash flow need between their baseline for their baseline minimum expenses. Okay, but then as you can look down here, ignore this for now, LTC costs. By the way, this is long-term care costs. On average, what we see individuals spend today in 2025, it's about $75,000 per year for a 2-year period. So, or in total, they need to really budget about $300,000 for long-term care costs if they needed long-term care. And that's the big if. 66% right now of individuals will need care at some point in retirement, but then the other 34% may not need care. And then the 66% that need care, some might need care for a month, some might need care for several years, okay, or even a decade. So a lot of uncertainty there, but we're going to ignore this as a goal for right now. And we're going to focus in on really what they're trying to accomplish. And the big one for them, we like to call it the go-go years spending. So the 3 different phases in retirement we look at are the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years. So oftentimes we see this kind of honeymoon phase of retirement in the beginning, which for them is going to be between, for Bruce, for 63 for the first 10 years until he turns 73, and for Jennifer from 61 to 71. I will say, though, having served retirees for more than a decade, I have found that sometimes the go-go years goes well beyond your 70s, okay? You can even creep into your 80s where they're still doing some travel. Maybe not for the majority, but certainly for some people. So if you've got that mentality, that mindset, you're keeping in good shape, you're in good health, God bless you, you may need go-go years for longer. So just keep that in mind. You may extend this buffer out for longer. But for them, they think, hey, 10 years, that's our goal. We want to have a lot of fun. So on top of our baseline expenses, we need about $15,000 per year. So if you add the 10K a month, which is about 120K per year, plus the 15K of additional spending, we're in the ballpark of around 135K is their total net cash flow need in that beginning, in those go-go years. And then it'll transition down after the go-go years spending it is exhausted after the first 10 years. And then also their mortgage is going to be paid off in their mid 70s. So actually their expenses, their cash flow will be even more freed up in their mid 70s. So if they decided to continue that go-go year spending for a longer period of time, they had that flexibility because their expenses are going down. But as you can see, we built in these other goals that right now we tagged at 0 for the baseline plan. And this is going to be annual gifting. We stress test 10 years, 20 years, and even a lump sum gift. Okay. So they have 2 adult children. They are in their early 30s. Early to mid 30s, 32 and 35. So keep that in mind. They have 2 adult children that are successful in their own right. They're starting families, and that's an important factor to note as well. Okay, why don't we transition over into the balance sheet? Okay, so the balance sheet, there's a lot of numbers on this page, but I guess maybe a couple of numbers that jump out to me. Number one, net worth, $3.1 million. This includes investable assets at about $2.5 million. And then their real estate assets at about $850,000. So total assets equate to about $3.4 million. And then you subtract out the mortgage, which is $223. That brings the total net worth in a very simple form of about $3.1 million. Obviously, things like vehicles, boats, jewelry, these are not included in this particular balance sheet because we want to keep this thing nice and tight. And we want to have financial assets on this balance sheet that are going to move the needle for their financial independence as well as their financial legacy. Other assets that are valuable could be included, but for this plan, for simplicity purposes, we wanted to leave those out. So really at a high level, if you kind of look at this one, if we say $135,000 is their need, and we divide that in to their total portfolio balance, let's do that right now, divide that by 2.5 million, the rate of withdrawal, if they were to retire today, is about 5.3%. Not too shabby, okay? Not too shabby. If you think about the 4% rule, Bill Bengen's famous Safe Max study, the 4% rule is famous because that is kind of the minimum, sort of that conservative baseline of a starting rate of withdrawal. Meaning there has never been a scenario in history where someone has run out of money before 30 years if they started with a 4% rate of withdrawal. But a 5% rate of withdrawal is completely acceptable because what we know is this does not account, or the 4% rule does not account for things in the future like Social Security, or like the go-go to slow-go transition. or taxes, okay, or an optimal investment strategy. So we know the 4% is just a baseline, a starting point. And I just kind of look at this as like a back of the napkin. Hey, where are we? If this was at 9%, I might say, no, this is not going to work. If it was at 8%, I might also be pretty cautious. But if it was at 7 or less, that could be an acceptable starting point to say, okay, let's transition on to see if this plan can actually work and actually run it through our models. But not terrible. But if we look at the balance sheet within the investable assets, they've got a nice mix. They've got non-qualified assets. They have qualified assets. And within their qualified plan, they have tax deferred. I'm going to call that TD. And then they also have tax-free Roth accounts. Okay. So non-qualified, that simply means non-retirement assets. So these are assets that they were contributed to on an after-tax basis. They have hopefully some gains within the portfolio, maybe some losses, maybe some gains. But if there are some unrealized losses, let's try to realize those losses, turn them into opportunities for tax loss harvesting for either this year or going forward. But ultimately, these assets in the non-qualified bucket are going to be a really valuable tool in that beginning phase of retirement for that income distribution to really keep their taxes down and allow these qualified plans to continue to cook and compound over the next 5, 10, even 15, 20 years. But a nice healthy mix between those three. And that's one of the things that we really want to look at is, okay, what is the distribution between taxable accounts, tax deferred accounts, and tax free accounts? And that's nicely illustrated here in this next slide. If we look, we've got the taxable assets, which we'll put in blue, that represents about 18% of the portfolio. The tax deferred, which is illustrated, we'll put that in orange, that's the majority, and that's about 53% of the portfolio. And then in green, and last but not least, we've got the tax free, and that represents about 29% of the portfolio. So really nice distribution on the tax free side. Okay. This is actually less common than it is common. That someone has a good chunk of change in that tax-free bucket that are approaching retirement today. Many folks that we talk to, the majority, and this is the case for them as well, the majority is in that tax-deferred bucket, but this is oftentimes even north of that, maybe closer to 75 or 85%. In this case, we've got a nice healthy mix. So this gives us options. But in this case, the traditional spending order is going to be in play. And the traditional spending order is simply, we're going to take the taxable account first. So we're going to start distributions from the taxable account first. Once those are exhausted, okay, so we've got those tax deferred accounts continuing to grow tax deferred. We've got the tax free accounts continuing to grow tax free. Once that taxable asset is exhausted, then we're going to begin to tap into that tax deferred bucket. Okay, those traditional IRAs or traditional 401ks. And then last but not least, if and when those are exhausted, then we'll tap into that tax free asset. Okay, now there could be some arguments to think about Roth conversions in the beginning phase, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. We're going to talk about those tax opportunities, but there could be an argument there. And therefore, that taxable bucket could not only be used for income distributions early on, but also to be used to pay the taxes on those conversions from those tax deferred assets. But in this case, we're going to focus on kind of the core baseline plan of let's start to draw down the taxable accounts first, then we'll tap into the tax deferred, and then we're going to tap into the tax free accounts. So let's talk about income sources. Okay. So in this plan, it's really simple. They have Social Security as their income, and then they're going to have income from their investment portfolio. Okay. Very simple. No pensions, no annuity income at this point in time. There could be an argument to discuss annuities, but no annuities on the balance sheet at this point in time. But what I want to talk about is the 3 different phases that they're going to experience in retirement. Okay. And yes, we've talked about the go-go years, the slow-go years, and the no-go years, but how does that actually translate into their actual rate of withdrawal on their portfolio, given the timing of those Social Security income sources? Okay. So really in the beginning phase, the first phase is no Social Security, and it's going to be withdrawals from investments. Okay. So WD, that's going to be standing for withdrawal. So in this phase, they're not going to have any income coming into the picture. They're going to solely rely on withdrawals from their investment portfolio, which could be a little unnerving for some people. Now, obviously, at the surface, Bruce is going to be 63. So he is technically eligible for Social Security benefits. So he could elect to take his Social Security early, but it would result in a pretty substantial reduction in Social Security benefits permanently. Okay. And not only that, his benefit is the larger one. And Jennifer is going to be using the spousal Social Security income when she ultimately does claim at her full retirement age, which for both of them is age 67. And by him taking early, if he were to pass away, then Jennifer is going to step up to the survivor benefit, to his benefit at that point in time. So not only would his benefit be permanently reduced during his lifetime, but also that survivor benefit would also be reduced permanently. So it's something to really keep in mind in terms of Social Security timing, and not just based on your own life expectancy, but also your spouse's life expectancy as well. So at its surface, the goal is to delay Social Security at least until full retirement age, maybe even until 70. And that's still a debate with them at this point in time. Based on longevity, it's kind of a coin flip at this point. They're kind of more inclined to start taking in Social Security at 67 because you got to weigh the pros and cons of certainly you could delay Social Security until 70 and you get the max benefit, but then you're drawing down your portfolio a little more aggressively. And what if you're drawing down during a downturn, during a bear market, during muted returns? Something to really consider. Phase 2 is going to be Social Security for Bruce is going to be the first one to claim. So he'll be 67 first. Then 2 years later, then Jennifer is going to turn 67. So Social Security will be that phase 2, and then partial withdrawals from the investments. Okay. In this phase, they're also going to be younger than age 75, which is an important date because age 75 for both of them is going to be their required beginning date. Okay. That means that's going to be the year in which they are forced to take out required minimum distributions. Okay. So that's going to be phase 3. So regardless if they need that income later on, remember, mortgage is going to be paid off. Go-go years are going to be by the wayside. So by the time they turn 75, they're going to have Social Security and require minimum distributions. So I'm going to call this RMD instead of rate of withdrawal rates because the withdrawal side, that's going to be flexible. They can choose to withdraw it. They can choose to change the withdrawal. Whereas an RMD, require minimum distribution, if you don't take that RMD, you're going to be slapped with a 25% penalty on what you should have taken out of your portfolio. So obviously we want to follow those RMDs, but those RMDs are going to be strictly related to those tax deferred accounts. Okay. Those traditional IRAs, traditional 401ks, not Roth accounts, not taxable brokerage accounts. So really important to note is that taxable bucket and that tax-free bucket, there are no required minimum distributions on those accounts. But obviously in this phase 1, there is going to be a 4-year gap until Social Security kicks in for Bruce. So 100% of that cash flow need is going to come from their investment portfolio only. So what I did is I illustrated this over time on this little line chart here. So on the y-axis, I had the rate of withdrawal. And then on the x-axis, I have Bruce's age. Okay. So that's important to note is that, Jennifer is 2 years younger. So if you kind of look at this like 63 or 61, and then so on and so forth. I just wanted to save a little bit of space and make it a little cleaner. Okay, but we're going to plot this out on how this actually plays out over time. So I ran this through my financial planning software. So I am taking into account inflation on this one and also a reasonable rate of return of about 6.7%. And I use 6.7% because they are a little bit more aggressive with their risk tolerance. Their current portfolio is a little more aggressive. It's closer to 90% in equities, 10% fixed income. They don't plan to necessarily dial that back significantly. They do want to maintain a healthy exposure in equities and retirement, and they frankly have the capacity to do so. But we targeted about an 85% equity exposure overall and about 15% fixed income, which our expectations are a little bit more muted than I think a lot of folks were saying, 6.7%. Okay, so in that phase 1 period where they're just relying on their portfolio withdrawals, we're going to call it about $142,000 is their need. Remember, we said 135 would be today. So we're going to build in a little bit of inflation there for both healthcare costs and also regular costs of living. And their portfolio grew to about $2.6 million, assuming a moderate growth rate. At that point in time, or in that beginning phase for that first 4 years, we're targeting a rate of withdrawal of about 5.4%. Okay, right here. Again, not something that's crazy out of the ordinary because we know that Social Security is going to kick in down the road. And truthfully, even if you look at Bill Bengen's study, his SafeMax study, many of those scenarios that he stress tested, the portfolio lasted well beyond 30 years, truthfully, even upwards of 40 years. Now, there were certainly some periods in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, high inflation, high interest rates, muted returns, multiple recessions, multiple bear markets, where the portfolio only lasted about 20 years. Okay, so there's certainly a risk is what is the timing of retirement? Do you have good fortunes where you're retiring into a great bull market, let's say from 2012 to 2021, good on you. But on the flip side, let's say you retired into a market like the lost decade from 2000 to 2010, where the S&P 500 would actually return a negative rate of return. That's a different story. Okay. But we can't predict the future in terms of returns, and we've got to use some sort of baseline assumption. But in that phase, one of the things to point out is that they're going to have very low tax implications because they're going to be specifically targeting that taxable brokerage account. Withdrawals on that are going to be very, very tax efficient because, again, they contributed on an after-tax basis. They have potentially some gains in the portfolio, but those gains are largely going to be treated as long-term capital gains on any sales. In addition, we can do some tax loss harvesting to try to offset some of those gains. And we can also use some of the income that the portfolio is generating from dividends from stocks or even interest from bonds to generate some cash flows too. So again, 5.4% rate of withdrawal, but it's going to be very, very tax efficient in that beginning phase. Okay, so then we transition to that first Social Security benefit, which is going to be for Bruce. So when he's 67, Jennifer's going to be 65. So she's not going to collect Social Security just yet. She's going to wait until she turns 67. That way she can get the maximum spousal benefit. But at 67, Jennifer will be 65. And the Social Security payments will begin for him, which is about $4,800 a month. At that point in time, the rate of withdrawal actually drops to about 4.4%. Okay. And then when she collects Social Security, okay, and at that point in time, he's going to be 69, she'll be 67, then the rate of withdrawal actually drops all the way down to about 3.5%. Okay. So now we're below that 4% benchmark from the Bill Bank and Safe Max. Okay. Now, certainly there could be an argument to delay until 70 to max Social Security benefits, but we've got to weigh the pros and cons of longevity. We've got to look at protection of longevity and inflation, while at the same time looking at spending down the portfolio aggressively. And we need to weigh those goals. But either way, the rate of withdrawal drops all the way down to about 3.5%. Okay. And then phase 3 kicks in. Okay. So phase 3 kicks in. This is when go-go years start to slow down at age 73. That's after 10 years. They've hopefully checked off a lot of their bucket list travel. Their expenses start to go down a little bit. And then RMDs kick in when he turns 75. Okay, so at this point in time, their rate of withdrawal drops all the way down when they turn 75, all the way down to about roughly 2.2%. Okay, and that's going to stay like that for pretty much the duration of their retirement. They're going to have to continue to take out RMDs and actually, truthfully, their rate of withdrawal actually go down a little bit more because their portfolio, their Roth account balances will go up. But for sake of simplicity, if we really look at this graph here, it's trending down throughout the duration of their retirement, throughout their life expectancy. So the rate of withdrawal starts higher in the 5.5% range and transitions down. But as we already talked about, the assumed rate of return for them is about 6.7% annually. So if they're earning about 6.7% annually, obviously, for simple math purposes, they did not even tap 6.7% of the portfolio at any point in time. Now, obviously, this ignores volatility in the markets. We have to take that into consideration. But from a pure math standpoint, their rate of withdrawal is below their expected rate of return over the duration of their retirement. So certainly, they could back down their risk. They could say, you know what, let's take on a little bit less risk. But they don't want to do that. And so therefore, what's going to happen is they're going to be left with a surplus in their portfolio at death. Their portfolio is not going to actually go down. It's going to increase over time because that rate of withdrawal is well below that 6.7% average expected rate of return that we're assuming. But before we get into that surplus, let's talk a little bit about taxes, okay? Because this is an important concept that we've talked about before in the podcast, talking about with every single one of our clients, is this concept of the Roth conversion window. So the Roth conversion window is essentially periods of time or a period of time in retirement when you transition from working to retirement where your income could go down. And for most people, that is at the beginning phase of retirement. So 62 is, Bruce's current age. So when he turns 63 is right here, his tax bracket goes down. Right now it's in the 22% range, goes down to the 10% range. So it drops dramatically, even though we're assuming they're taking out, remember, $141, roughly $1,000 in the portfolio in that beginning phase in those go-go years. Taxes remain very, very low because, again, the only taxable income will be those realized capital gains, dividends, interest income. It's going to be no Social Security, no distributions from IRAs yet. Okay. Now, if we do conversions, obviously that income is going to be included in their taxable income in that given year. So certainly that could increase their tax bracket. But one thing we look at here is there's certainly a nice Roth conversion window in those go-go years in that first phase when they're delaying Social Security. And the longer they delay Social Security, the more opportunity there could be for conversion. So if they push 67 back to, let's say, or down to about 70, that Roth conversion window could go out a little bit more. Okay. There could be a longer window to do those conversions. Okay. And then what you'll see is is taxable income goes up a little bit because that at that point in time, then they're beginning to collect Social Security. And then they're also starting to tap into some of the withdrawals from the tax deferred accounts because that taxable account is beginning to be exhausted at that point in time after those first 4 to 5 years. So that income or those distributions from those IRAs will be included in ordinary income. So therefore their tax bracket goes up. Now, just one thing to note on this one, this is federal income taxes. And as you can see, the top rate for them is 25%. This is actually assuming the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act sunsets after this year. That's kind of the default in our system in the software right now. If I were a betting man, I would say there's a very high probability that the tax cuts were going to be extended or even potentially made permanent, and that the brackets are not going to revert back to the 2017 levels. But again, our software, it is what it is for now, but we can change this at any point in time. But I think the story is still tax brackets could go up for them during that period of when Social Security begins. And then when their go-go years are over, so remember that age 73, go-go years go down, the mortgage is paid off, so their expenses ultimately go down. There's another Roth conversion window here where they could take advantage of filling up these brackets with RC Roth conversions. Okay. So the benefit there is they pay the tax on some of those tax deferred accounts. They maximize some of the income in these brackets that they otherwise weren't maximizing, and therefore reduce the impact of RMDs later on. Because what's going to happen is age 75 and then age 77, this is when Jennifer is going to be 75, RMDs will begin. And ultimately, over time, as those balances continue to grow, that's going to potentially push them into a higher tax bracket. So this evidence by this happens at 82 for them, but it could be the opposite. It can actually, these Roth conversions, we can kind of front load some of those taxes and therefore keep this tax bracket pretty level throughout the duration of their lifetime. And we'll look at that. And certainly that's an opportunity. I think one of the biggest considerations there is certainly what is their lifetime tax bracket, but what's the tax bracket of their 2 adult children? Now, some of the facts about their 2 adult children, they're starting families, but they're both in high income tax states and they're high earners. So they're successful in their own right. So inheriting assets inside of these tax deferred accounts could actually prove to be problematic for those beneficiaries. So if it's important for you to maximize, not only minimize your lifetime taxes, but also maximize your legacy on an after-tax basis, you might consider doing some Roth conversions to let that legacy pass on more tax efficiently. Okay. But again, there are pros and cons to doing conversions. It's not a one size fits all, just do conversions just because you think your kids are going to be in a lower tax bracket. There could be some reasons to keep assets in a tax deferred account, which we talked about before in the podcast. Okay. But the tax scenario for me, the 2 opportunities are number 1, Roth conversions. And number 2 is this concept called asset location. Okay. Now, as we looked at before in their balance sheet, they have a nice mix of taxable assets, tax deferred assets, and tax free assets. So we want to be mindful. We want to be smart on where we own those tax inefficient investments, not in the taxable account, spoiler alert, and where we own those tax efficient investments. Those assets you want to own inside of that taxable brokerage account. So what investments are tax inefficient? Taxable bonds, mutual funds, or funds that spit out a lot of capital gains, unrealized capital gains, or better known as phantom capital gains. Okay. Whereas tax efficient investments are truthfully ETFs that are inside of the stock market, US or international stock markets. A lot of those have qualified dividends, which are going to be treated as your long-term capital gains rates. Funds or ETFs that are not spitting out unrealized capital gains have a low turnover ratio. Those are tax efficient. Even municipal bonds, you can throw in that category as well, depending on the tax bracket that you're in. But you got to weigh the pros and cons of municipal bonds. Just because you are in a high tax bracket now doesn't mean you're going to be that way for the next 20 to 30 years. Because again, evidenced by this, tax bracket for Bruce and Jennifer went down. Okay. So even if they were in, let's say, the 32% bracket today, they could be down in the 10% or the 12% bracket at the beginning phase of retirement. At that point in time, does it make sense to own municipal bonds? Probably not. Okay. So it's one of those things that you need to consistently review and change that strategy depending on your tax rate. But asset location, in my opinion, is another big opportunity for them. But let's get back to this concept of this surplus. So what does that surplus look like? Right here, 99% probability success. That's overfunded in my mind. Obviously, it's a great score if you're looking at a GPA, that's going to be an A+, right? But ultimately here, 99% funded, this just means you're going to have a significantly higher probability of really increasing your ending net worth at your death, which for some people may be really important. Maybe that is you. Maybe you want to maximize what's left behind to your heirs, okay? But at this point in time, at Jennifer's age 90, the median trial for our Monte Carlo simulation, which is just like a fancy term for a stress test of a bunch of different hypothetical returns, we run 1,000 different hypotheticals. The median trial would be trial 500. So not the most optimistic, not the most pessimistic. There's about a $4.6 million, let's do it in dollar, $4.6 million ending investment portfolio value, which if you remember, today's dollar value is 2.5 million. Okay. This excludes the primary residence, by the way. So that's an additional asset that most likely will be transitioned on to the two kids as well. But this will be Jennifer's age 90. Okay. So the reason I point that out is because at that point in time, their son is going to be age 65 and their daughter is going to be age 62. So I've had clients inherit assets in retirement. Does it hurt them? No. But ultimately, they retired based on their own stewardship of their own income and assets over time for a long, long period of time. They were disciplined. They saved well. They invested well. They stuck to a plan and they were ultimately able to fire their boss, enter retirement. And so oftentimes that happens right in the sweet spot, 65, 62, 60 years old, maybe a little later for some, okay, depending on how much you love your job. If you're Bruce Lee, you don't need to work at all. But in this scenario, we're not talking about the Bruce Lee. We're just talking about a hypothetical Bruce Lee. So age 65 and 62, what if they're retired at that point in time? They're successful in their own right. They were probably managed to squirrel away some dollars in the 401k and Roth accounts and HSAs over time. They probably built up a nice little nest egg. Maybe they're already retired. And so again, I've had clients that have inherited assets in retirement. Does it hurt them? No. But would it have been more beneficial for them to receive some of those assets in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s? I would probably say yes. Okay. Just knowing the cost of living and the cost of raising children and just everything going on in life during those periods of time, life is chaotic. Okay. Would it have been more beneficial? And would you, as the client, as the mom or dad, would you have found value in actually seeing your legacy be utilized while you're living as opposed to when you're no longer here? There is no value. Okay. For you, obviously. For them, it will be multi-generational impact. No question. $4.6 million plus the home value. Now, obviously, we're looking in future dollars, not today's dollars. So in today's dollars, it probably feels closer to what their investment portfolio is today. Maybe a little bit more, maybe in that $3 million range. But again, would you find value in actually giving with a warm hand versus a cold one? If the answer is yes, you might consider doing some lifetime giving. That's why we stress tested some of those hypothetical goals at the beginning of what if they gifted for 10 years? What if they gifted for 20 years? What if they gifted as a lump sum? Okay. So for simplicity purposes, let's talk about the annual gift exclusion. Right now, the annual gift exclusion is $19,000 per donor per recipient. Okay. So you as the donor, you can give anybody $19,000 and you don't have to file a gift tax return. Okay. So there's no tax implication to the recipient. There's no tax implication to you. Now, if you're married, you can double up on that. So that's $38,000 that you can give. And so if they have two children, hypothetically, they can give $76,000, $38,000 apiece in 2025 to their children and not have to file any gift tax return. If they give more, it's not the end of the world. Okay. Ultimately, what that does, you don't have to pay taxes on that today, but it reduces your lifetime gift exclusion. Okay. So the lifetime gift exclusion is $15 million. So you could essentially give away $15 million during your lifetime or at death and not have to worry about any federal estate taxes. Now, if you have a very high net worth, that could impact you a little bit. Okay. So that's something to consider. But even if you do have an ultra high net worth, maybe you do give some of your assets today. I've had clients do this in the past. They'll set up an irrevocable trust for one of their children and give the trust $1 million. And now instead of that $1 million being in the client's estate, which is going to be subject to the 45% federal estate tax, now it's going to be in the child's hands today. And all of that growth is going to be out of their estate. So even if you do give more than the annual gift exclusion, doesn't mean that's a bad idea. You just need to consult with your attorneys. You need to consult with your financial planners, your financial advisors to make sure you figure out what is the best solution for you and your family. But again, in this scenario, they have the capacity to keep things really simple and gift $38,000 per child or $76,000 per year in 2025. But if we did that, or if they did that, that would increase their rate of withdrawal pretty significantly. Okay. That'd probably push them into the 7.5%, 8% rate of withdrawal. So instead of doing that, let's assume, you know what, in the first few years, let's say they kind of eased into retirement. Maybe they didn't start giving right away. maybe they waited until they started Social Security, or at least Bruce started Social Security. So maybe they waited 4 or 5. So instead of $38,000 being the max, you can give without filing a gift tax return, the annual exclusion. Maybe it's just over 44,000. If we adjust that for inflation, beginning in 2030, they start to gift that amount. And so again, they could double that up and they could say 88,000. But again, that would push them significantly high in terms of rate of withdrawal. And that could jeopardize their ability to maintain financial independence, which is obviously probably not a good idea. So in this scenario, let's keep things simple. And let's just say they gifted $22,000 per child per year, child per year. And let's say they did that. So that's a total of $44K per year. And let's say they did that for 20 years. So if they did this, if we look at the impact on rate of withdrawal, as you can see, it still starts in the beginning at the mid 5% range. Okay. And this is when they're transitioning in. And then when Bruce starts Social Security, that's when the gifting begins and that rate of withdrawal goes up a little bit. Okay. It does go down a little bit because this is when Social Security really kicks in. This year right here, this is only a partial year for Bruce taking Social Security. So the rate of withdrawal is actually pushing 7%, but it kind of levels off just around 6% for quite a while. And then again, transitions down because end of the go-go years, transitions down because the mortgage is paid off. Okay. And ultimately, you'll see this rate of withdrawal continue to go down because their portfolio is growing in excess of what they're taking out. So ultimately, the corresponding rate of withdrawal goes down as well. Now, we need to take into account inflation, but ultimately what you'll see is the rate of withdrawal, it's still in that 5 to 6% range for the most of retirement. And then it transitions down into that 2% range. This is sort of post-giving. Okay, so this is that 20-year period from right here to here. This is that 20-year period of annual gifts. Okay, we kind of isolate that. So again, rate of withdrawal isn't astronomical. It's not like it's in the 7.5 to 8.5% range. So we're just kind of stress testing this to say, hey, hypothetically, if you did a little bit of this giving during your lifetime, as opposed to leaving all of these assets at death, what is the impact? So ultimately what happens is the same median trial, the probability of success goes down from 99% to 75%. But again, 75% is still a darn good score when it comes to these Monte Carlo simulations. Okay. There's a whole nother podcast episode on Monte Carlo. But ultimately, the median trial, the ending investment portfolio value is about $2 million. And during their lifetime, they gifted over that 20 years, because if we adjust that for inflation at 3% a year, again, they started at 44,000 and did that over 20 years, adjusted for inflation. They gifted $1,183,000 during their lifetime. Okay, so if you add these two numbers up, we're looking at right around $3 million. Okay, would be essentially their total legacy. But again, 1.1 million was given during lifetime. And if you take into consideration the time value of money, and when do those assets or those gifts have the highest utility for your kids? Is it when they're 65 and 62, or is it in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s? And so, yes, the total legacy amount went down from that 4 million and some change number down to about $3 million. But again, those assets and those gifts are now in your kids' hands, and hopefully they're good stewards. And that's one of the benefits of giving during lifetime is you got to get a sense of, hey, what are they doing with the money? Are they spending frivolously? Are they buying like Ferraris with the money and Rolexes, or are they actually putting it to work? Are they spending it on education or experiences with their kids, or putting it on a down payment on their first home, or whatever it might be, or contributing? Maybe it's maxing out the Roth account or helping them max out their 401k plans. Okay. There are so many benefits to giving during lifetime because you can kind of see the impact of those lifetime gifts. And that could also impact your gifting in the future. Okay. So if you're kind of seeing that your kids are being good stewards of the money, you probably want to continue to do the giving, versus if they're not being good stewards of those gifts, maybe you taper it off, or maybe you cut it off completely. And maybe that also impacts what you do with your ultimate estate plan. Okay. Now, of course, there are a lot of unknowns to this. This plan, these assumptions are guaranteed to be wrong. Okay. Inflation, we've got interest rate assumptions, we've got market return assumptions, we've got longevity assumptions, sequence of return risk, recessions, bear markets, long-term care risk. And we didn't even talk about that. What if there's a long-term care need and all of a sudden they gifted all of their assets away and now they need long-term care? That's a problem. Okay. But again, it's one of those things to kind of remind you that there could be some opportunity there. If you have a little bit of a surplus in your plan. If your Monte Carlo simulation is overfunded, and you've got a nice little surplus in there, it could be a good opportunity to potentially look at some lifetime giving. Or maybe it's even charitable giving. Maybe you don't have children and all of your assets are going to charity. Maybe it's charitable giving. Maybe it's increased spending. Maybe in the go-go years, you're like, hey, you know what? Instead of spending 15,000, let's spend 30,000 a year in our go-go years and have a lot of fun and maybe start to fly first class as opposed to in coach. I mean, these are all things from a financial planning standpoint that you can consider if you have a well-funded plan. Okay. But there's so many factors to throw in there. There are so many hypotheticals and unknown, but hopefully this is kind of a good starting point to really think through this idea of over saving for retirement and having these options. Okay. So just some final thoughts on this one, but just a few final thoughts. The first thing I'll say is don't just focus on the accumulation phase, have a plan for the decumulation phase. Okay. And try to get a handle on how much is ultimately enough. Okay. There are financial planning calculators out there. Engaging with the financial advisor, how much is enough based on your circumstances, your longevity, your income goals, your risk tolerance. Okay, all of those factors impact how much you're ultimately going to need. So you see all these people or these YouTube channels that say this is how much you need to retire. You need $1 million or you need $2 million. That's BS. Okay, nobody knows exactly how much you need. Only a customized planning process will uncover that information. Number two, if you've managed to save a little bit of surplus, you have multiple levers you can pull. Okay. The first one, you can retire a little bit earlier. You could potentially spend more. You could give to more. You could also reduce risk. You feel like you've won the game. You could potentially reduce risk. Or you can, on the flip side, you could actually increase risk. This is the concept of risk capacity. Okay. You also have the opportunity to maximize financial legacy at your death. Maybe that is really important to you. Maybe you'd rather wait until you pass to leave that financial legacy. Maybe you don't want to disincentivize your children from working hard. Now, I would argue if you've done well on the parenting side, which is easier for me to say right now, my kids are much younger than an adult child. But if you've done well, you know if the impacts of legacy at death during a lifetime are going to be a problem. Okay. Now, if you think they're going to be a problem, you're probably not going to do lifetime gifts anyways. Okay. If you think they're not going to be a problem, then begs the question, should you give now? Should you give at death? Okay. But then you could also think about some combination of all of these things, all of these levers above. Maybe you could reduce risk and give more. Maybe you could retire earlier and spend more. Maybe you could do a little bit of gifting, but also maximize legacy at death. There are a lot of opportunities depending on your own plan, your own situation, your own circumstances that you can make adjustments to. And that's really the fun part about retirement income plan. The third thing I'd say, if you do plan to give during lifetime, make sure to communicate with your beneficiaries. Educate them on what it means to be a good steward of the capital. Educate them a little bit on some of the behaviors that got you to where you are today. Have open conversations about money. I think the more conversations you can have about money, the better. I've seen this mistake time and time again where folks did not have any conversations with their children, their adult children. I'm not talking about little kids. I'm talking about their kids in their 50s and 60s, even clients that I've served. And all of a sudden, mom or dad leaves them a large inheritance. Or maybe they set up an estate plan and they're kind of scratching their head like, why did they set this up like this? That could cause some issues. Okay. So I think the more you can have that communication with your beneficiaries, with your adult children, and with your trusted contacts, the better it's going to be. You don't have to divulge every detail. You don't have to tell them exactly how much you plan to leave or exactly how much you have, but just having some conversations and getting a feel for where they are from a financial literacy standpoint. Good idea to do. Number 4, on that token, on those same lines, if you are doing some lifetime giving, observe how they spend the gifts. Are there concerns about mismanagement? Okay, again, this could also impact what you do from a lifetime giving standpoint over time, or structure your estate plans. If you're seeing them spending frivolously, or maybe they're married to someone who's not good with managing money. This is very common. You're like, hey, I trust my son or daughter, but their spouse, not so much. Maybe you decide to set up some sort of living trust that becomes irrevocable at your death or incapacity to protect those assets, keep them in the family, just in case that marriage didn't work out, or just in case that spouse is trying to just go ahead and raid that inheritance up front. So again, thinking about the benefits of lifetime giving would also give you some insight on how you structure your estate plans. And then finally, number 5, don't worry about it being set in stone. Okay. Just because you've got this plan mapped out that you plan to give annually $38,000 per year for the next 20 years doesn't mean you have to do that. Maybe you give more, maybe you give less, depending on their life circumstances and what the needs are. That's probably more common than not, is sort of looking at, hey, you know what? My kids have 4 kids going to college in the next 10 years. maybe I ramp up giving now. And then after they graduate, maybe I taper that down. Or you know what? Hey, they're having weddings and they're buying first homes. Maybe I want to increase some of my giving now to help them out during that startup phase in life. So don't worry about being a set in stone type of thing, an irrevocable decision. It could be something that's fluid and reviewed and managed over time. So that's it for today, everybody, for the Whiteboard Retirement Plan. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you found value. I hope you liked the episode. If you did like the episode, make sure to like it on YouTube. That helps us a lot. And also make sure to share it with a friend or colleague who would find value. Okay, this is really ultimately how we are reaching more people. Just from my experience reading the analytics, there's a lot of retirement-related content out there. But ultimately, all of you all in PFR Nation that are liking our content, subscribing, leaving reviews, that helps us a ton to impact and reach more people, which is what we're all about. If you're finding value and you're like, hey, this is great, but I'd love some help on this one. I'd love to chat with you one-on-one. We are accepting new clients, so you can start with the retirement readiness questionnaire that's linked in the episode. We'd love to learn a little bit more about you first to see what you're looking to accomplish, see if we're a good fit, and we will follow up with a personalized video with our initial observations on your situation. And so we'd love to engage with our listeners. We'd love to work with our listeners. I've been joking with my team internally is that, hey, I don't want to take on any new clients unless they are podcast listeners. That is my goal for the next 15, 20 years of my career, okay? Because I have a lot of fun talking to all of you PFR Nation. You guys are great people. I really value everyone who's been following along our content over the past few years. It helps a ton. And again, it's really great to hear and read comments, positive comments and feedback based on the content we're putting out there. Because it is a lot of heavy lifting. I don't need to do this, okay? Truthfully, I could have a lot more free time if I didn't do YouTube or I didn't do podcasts, but I enjoy it. I believe this is my way of paying it forward. I've been very blessed with a great career so far. God willing, I'll have another 20 plus years in this career. Would love to keep it rolling. And this honestly just gives me a lot of energy and excitement in this stage of my career. But again, I hope to see you all next week. Until next time, this is Kevin Lau signing off.